we thought necessary. Well, I offered them round at one point, and quite rightly, the lads all refused them, because if they had taken them, as I knew, and I didn't take mine either, you see a German behind every blade of grass. You get overhyped, so you rather better not have them.
It was now a case of holding on until the rest of the division arrived, and at this stage their commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, had no reason to suspect that this wouldn't happen within a matter of hours. Repeated attacks by German infantry had been repelled with a force that left them in no doubt about the quality of the men in front of them. It would take artillery and armour to blast the Paras out of the houses. At about 9:30, 22 vehicles of the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion returned from Nijmegen and attempted to charge across the bridge. The attack was foiled by British mines, anti-tank guns and grenades, leaving the northern ramp partially blocked by burnt-out vehicles.
On the Monday morning, we heard sounds coming from across the bridge, engines, noises, and somebody shouted, "That's 30 Corps, they've arrived." Well, we said, let's wait and see. And it wasn't, because it was the Victor Grabner's recce battalion, and his scout cars came across the bridge, about 3 or 4 of them. 2 Parrott had pulled a string of mines across, but all by one of those scout cars managed to miss the mines and went over the bridge and on into the town. They didn't get fired at too much because they came rather quickly before we were really ready for them. But they were followed fairly quickly after that with all the armoured type, the half tracks, open tops with soldiers in them and so on, and 2 Parrott who were much closer than we were, buildings right up to here, but we could see them from our first floor. We could see them, although we were some distance from them, and we fired down onto these chappies as well, and so many of the drivers of those vehicles were hit that the vehicles were meshed up together, and the dozen or more of them formed a complete block on the top end of the road, so nothing could get across one way or the other. And the crews of those vehicles were all killed.
Some 8 miles west of Arnhem, the 2 battalions of the 1st Air Landing Brigade that were defending the drop zones were awaiting the arrival of Brigadier Shan Hackett's 4 Para Brigade in the 2nd major lift of the operation. Unfortunately, the Germans had discovered a map in a wrecked glider near Nijmegen. It detailed everything about the Market Garden Plan, including when and where subsequent supply drops would come. How or why the map came to be in the glider in the first place remains a mystery to this day, but it meant that 4 Para was in for a very rough reception.
This is South Ginkle Heath. This vast area was the dropping zone on the 2nd day of the operation for the 2,500 men of the 4th Parachute Brigade. Their equipment in gliders would land on the same dropping zone as the 1st Parachute Brigade had landed on the previous day, and by road that's about 5 miles away from here, although the distance across country is somewhat shorter. And the task since the previous evening, the first night of the operation, the 17th September 1944, of the 7th Battalion, the King's Own Scottish Borders, had been to defend this area, to protect it, to prepare the area for the landing of the 4th Parachute Brigade. But of course, in being here, they alerted to the Germans to the fact that there was a purpose for their presence, and that purpose could only be subsequent airborne landings, and the Germans set about bringing to bear forces from the east, from the west and from the north to try to prevent the drop from occurring successfully, to try and break it up at that most critical time in a parachute landing, the moment when people exit the aircraft, have hit the ground and are trying to organise themselves ready to conduct operations.
The trip over was smooth. Bit bumpy, but smooth over the channel. And eventually we came to the time when the crew said, like, you know, we'll be jumping in a minute. Meanwhile, we started coming under small machine gun fires, which we thought was Spandau, and 88mm anti-tank guns. And the first thing I was aware of, or the next thing I was aware of, was that the port engine was shot out and the starboard engine was on fire on the other side of the aircraft. Half a dozen or more of the chaps were dead as far as I could see on the floor, killed by small arms machine gun fire. And I was a bit worried whether we were all going to get out alive because the plane was going down fairly fast. In fact, I believe it was no more than about 350 to 400 feet from the ground when we eventually bailed out. But it was that or go in with it, of course.
It's a vast area, and really the King's Own Scottish Borderers, despite their best efforts, could only achieve local success. The net effect was that when the 4th Parachute Brigade landed, it was in effect an opposed landing, and there were a considerable number of casualties from the fire which was put down by the Germans by both small arms and mortars on the heath. And it is a true heath, unlike Renkum, where the 1st Parachute Brigade had landed, in that this is composed of heather and dry grass and therefore burned very successfully. In burning, it caused huge problems of smoke obscuration, not just for our own soldiers but for those of the Germans, and of course did considerable damage to wounded soldiers, many of whom were quite badly burned, some of whom died in the most horrid circumstances, being incapable of escaping from the flames as they gradually grew closer and closer to them.
Despite the strength of the German defence, the entire 1st Airborne Division had now landed in Holland, and the full weight of its effort could be put into the push to reach the bridge at Arnhem.
Having arrived, they set off into the town, moving towards the east. It's perhaps important to remember in all this discussion of the impact and the effect of various things on the Germans is that there are clear German reports of the impact of the sudden arrival of the 4th Parachute Brigade, which changed the balance of the number of manoeuvre units based on a battalion, which were ranged against the Germans. And there are reports of a number of German officers who were deeply concerned that the weight of force which was being delivered against them was more than they would be able to bear, and that actually this attack by this elite airborne division was going to be something they would have great difficulty in overcoming, if indeed they could overcome it at all.
In the early hours of Tuesday morning, the airborne forces attempted to break through to the bridge and relieve their increasingly beleaguered comrades. The 3rd Battalion was the first to try in the early hours. They got as far as the St. Elizabeth Hospital before running into a fierce German blocking line. With only 50 men left, it was clear that the 3rd Battalion was not going to be able to get through on its own. As they were withdrawing, the men of the 3rd ran into the men from the 1st Battalion, who were advancing along the river embankment. They were to be supported later by the South Staffords, who were to advance along the other side of the road. In the darkness, all seemed to be going well. But as daylight beckoned, they were spotted by German positions up on high ground in front of them and to the left. To make matters worse, they were then spotted by German positions in brickworks on the south bank. The airborne men were completely hemmed in as machine guns and mortars swept their positions from 3 directions.
Although it must be said, and it is perfectly clear, they gave the Germans a hell of a fight, and they came very close indeed to doing it, but with only an officer or two and half a dozen men left alive or standing on their feet by the time they'd reached the German position, they really didn't have enough strength to sustain a push through the German positions and then move on beyond it and do anything sensible in the area of the bridge. They were literally down to a handful of men.
Large numbers of casualties were taken before the airborne troops withdrew. The one positive note in an otherwise darkening picture was that the South Staffs had managed to temporarily liberate the house in which Major General Urquhart was hiding, enabling him to escape and return to his divisional headquarters in the Hartenstein. But it was the end of the 1st Para Brigade's attack at Arnhem. For the men at the bridge, the situation was getting desperate. The Germans, realizing that the British tanks intended to cross at Nijmegen, needed to get reinforcements south as quickly as possible. But most of those reinforcements were to the northwest of Arnhem. The paratroopers on the bridge, therefore, had to be removed as quickly as possible. Tanks were brought in to blast each house in which the Paras were hiding at point-blank range. They had originally gone to Arnhem with rations for 48 hours. Now, 3 days later, the Paras were running out of everything: food, water, and above all, ammunition. They faced a stark choice: surrender or die.
We would